Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Today, we're going to look at the feeding of transition milk to dairy calves, and here to provide his perspective is Dr. Al Kertz. Welcome, Al. Nice to see
Thank,
you.
thank you, Sarah. It's good to be back.
For those of you tuning in, as always, Dr. Kurtz's column is shared in the link below. So if you want to check that out, you can click on that and read through that. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to post those in the Q&A window on your screen or in the comment area on the social media feed where you're watching this from. Dr. Kurtz, I'm going to turn it over to you now to share your thoughts on the feeding of transition milk.
Well, transition milk is usually defined as the first 3 days of milking after a cow has a calf, but not the very first milking because that's colostrum. That's true colostrum. Sometimes people use those terms interchangeably. I read sometimes in a journal of dairy science, somebody said they fed colostrum for 3 days. Well, did you really feed for 3 days, or was it colostrum first and then 3 days of transition milk? So, what we're going to talk about is the milk after colostrum. Now, that's that's a whole nother subject which we've discussed a number of times, and we know that from various analysis that from the first milking, which is colostrum, the composition of the milk will change over the next 3 days till it becomes more normal. And that's why in the 1970s, when I really got into the industry, it was fairly common recommendation and practice that you not only fed colostrum at the first feeding, but then you fed the transition milk for the first 3 days before you began to feed a milk replacer. But what happened is dairies got larger, they began to change how that was handled. And the primary reason I think that transition milk was fed to calves was because I guess officially it couldn't be sold because it didn't have the composition that's whole milk or legal milk. But as dairies got larger, they no longer were feeding it to calves. And so they put it into the bulk tank. And, there's nothing harmful or bad about it. It's got a high level of nutrients. And so its composition was diluted out by the bulk of the milk. Or else, as dairies also got larger, they started feeding waste milk from cows in a hospital string, and they might pool some of the transition milk into it because those cows were in the same maybe facility at that particular time until the cows either got well or they got beyond the first day or two of close monitoring. So transition milk now has a little bit of a renaissance going on. And at the 2006 American Dairy Science Association, there was an opening session speaker, and he was from the University of California, Davis, as I recall. And they were presenting information about what they were finding with the composition of human milk. They had much more expansive and sensitive analytical equipment. And so, as they were monitoring the transition of human milk, they were surprised to find that there were tiny amounts of some polysaccharides, commonly called oligosaccharides. They were puzzled by that because, first of all, there wasn't enough there to make any difference to the infants. And second of all, the infants couldn't digest it anyway because they were polysaccharides. They were not like starch or sugar. So after some thought and so on, they finally figured it out. Those levels, those tiny levels of oligosaccharides were not there for the infant, but for the bacteria, the microbes in the infant's gut. And that's why they were beneficial, because we know from studies on the human side that breastfed infants generally have less digestive problems, they have less infectious problems, including inner ear infection, that sort of thing. And now we're finding out on the calf side that it's primarily because of the beneficial effects of those kinds of bacteria. And so that's why the milk was designed to feed that. So more recently, there's been some work about that in calves, and so we're going to take a look at that. There's a group that was at the University of Alberta, and that include Michael Steele, who now moved a couple years ago to the Guelph University, and you would recognize his name because we've evaluated his studies a number of times. And so that those two people have spent more time than any other group looking at the composition of transition milk and then how that might impact young calves. So if we look at the very first table, here's a table that's pulled together by one time by Mike Van Amberg from various sources that you see, the authors. And you look at the composition of transition milk. The first thing you'll notice at the top line, gross energy, colostrum milk has a very high energy level because it has such a high fat level. But it's all these other components that are present in colostrum that you don't find hardly at all are at very low levels in mature milk, which is usually about 4 days later. So immunoglobulins are for antibody protection. Lactoferrin is antibacterial, so it's gone at the end of that transition period. You see some of the hormones: insulin, glucagon, prolactin, growth hormone, IGF-1 and alpha, leptin, cortisol, and so on. The common factor about these are they have beneficial effects in calves, and they're often anabolic, which means that they foster growth and protein deposition. So that leads us then to the second slide, where there have been some more recent studies at Michigan State University. And the graduate student's name is Van Soest. And the first time I talked to him, I said, "Are you related to Pete Van Soest, who's done all this studies about fiber and so on and so forth?" He said, "No, I'm not the first one to ask him that because that's an unusual name," but he didn't know that he was directly related. But, people might notice him because of that. So there was a abstract presentation in 2019 originally at the Dairy Science meetings. And then more recently, there was a full publication in the Journal of Dairy Science last year. So in these studies, calves were fed either transition milk or milk replacer for 4 days. And you can see that in the table, they were fed the second day of transition milk or the third day of transition milk, or rather the milking. So second milking, the third milking, or the fourth milking of transition milk or milk replacer for 5 days. And then they were sacrificed and they did some measurements. And so when you look at the composition of the milkings, you see as you go across the board from left to right, second milking to milk replacer, that the levels of the IgGs and the solids decreases, so it becomes more normal milk. Protein level decreases, fat level, lactose, and of course the energy value decreases. And if you look at milk replacer, there's not a lot of commonality with the various transition milk because they have higher solids and the like. So what they did was when they sacrificed these calves, then they looked primarily at the intestinal lining. And there are what we call villi, which is a plural villus, if you remember your Latin, if you had any. Those are like the real tiny projections off the intestinal wall that absorb nutrients. So they're a good indicator, just like papillae length and so on measurements are in the rumen. So they found that as these calves were fed either one of those or any of those 2, 3, or 4 milkings of transition, they had twice the villus length, the width, and what they call the crip ratio and mucosal length in the intestinal sections after sacrificing compared to milk replacer. It doesn't mean milk replacer isn't a good nutritional source. It just says that the transition milk, like colostrum, has these many factors which have more benefit beyond just the nutritional level. Now, more recently, we had this group at the University of Alberta, and so you can go to the text there. You can see that in 2016 at a symposium, they had a major presentation, and that was later published in Journal Dairy Science, which you see. And they found that dairy calves fed colostrum immediately after birth not only increased the passive transfer of immunity, but it had beneficial effects on the bacteria in the colon and the lower gut, and whether there were any infections or not that were surfaced or realized. So that was the first major publications in these areas. And last year at the ADSA meeting, then there was another symposium presentation, and one of those scientists from the University of Alberta, Guan, you can find the reference down below, indicated that some of the critical roles of gut interactions in the intestinal that are beyond just, again, the nutritional thing. For instance, how they're fed and their nutrition determines how they colonize the gut after birth and even the kind of bacteria that they are. And then they further stated that the establishment of the calf gut microbiome, which is a complete part of it, is a complex process that is also influenced by not only the host, which is the cow producing the milk, and the calf, but the microbes together with their environmental factors, such as what diet is the calf fed, or even the cow, the management, the farm, and so on. So the microbiota, which is the plural, have direct and indirect impact on the gut function, including its development and metabolism, nutrient absorption, the barrier to pathogenic bacteria so they don't get absorbed from the gut, or even their activity in the gut. And then here's the other amazing thing: endocrine and neuron transmitter secretions. So these bacteria have secretions that impact the physiology and the endocrinology of the calf. And that's phenomenal. 5 years or 6 years ago, we wouldn't have even thought about that as a possibility. So some of the other comments that the scientists presented was that this knowledge is still in its infancy, but that more and more evidence has revealed that gut microbiology in pre-weaned calves can be affected by early life nutrition, rearing environment, and their health status and the treatments. And then finally, they stated that the metabolic functions of the gut microbiome and how it influences the energy metabolism, growth, and development, as well as metabolic and physiologic changes of calves, are in its infancy. So that's just a major new area of research which can have great impact.
It's really interesting to see something that, we thought we knew back then, right? That now we're looking at it, and it's a little different, so to speak. So with that in mind, and knowing what's kind of known now, there's still some research to be done, it sounds like. What's your bottom line recommendation? What should folks be thinking about?
Well, we should repeat a little bit of history. Find some way to go back to feeding transition milk for the first 2 or 3 days after colostrum. Now, the interesting thing is, there was a reason that the recommendation was in the 1970s to feed transition milk. So we knew it was beneficial. We just didn't know why and how beneficial it was, nor did we know what some of these factors were that we now can not only measure, but we know more about them. So I think the real challenge is, from a practical standpoint, is for dairy farms now to begin to think about, well, how can we separate out transition milk from cows in the first 3 days after colostrum, so that we can continue to feed that to the calves for 3 days of life before we go off and feed them milk replacer or pasteurized waste milk or whatever else we feed them, because that further helps those calves do better. And we know that the better the calves do in the first month or two, not only from a growth standpoint, but from a digestive upset or infectious standpoint, the more we minimize those problems, the better those calves grow as heifers and the better they produce milk when they go into lactation. So that is a big factor in what kind of cows they become. And it all comes back to how are we treating our calves.
So you mentioned the practicality of feeding transition milk. I mean, what do they need to do? I mean, we used to do it. What's really changed, or what's that going to take? I mean, can we get into any kind of details on that?
Well, as we look, as dairies got larger, they have a close-up area for cows before they calve, and then move them into maternity pens right before they calve. They'll milk them out there. And if they have any hospital cows, they'll have an area where they milk the hospital cows. And then usually that milk is mingled together, or else the cow only stays for a day or so or two in the maternity area before she gets moved into a fresh cow pen. So what it means is we have to come up with some kind of a simple process where you can keep the cow in a maternity pen area, or maybe you have a transition pen area, for another 2 or 3 days after they've had their calf and after they've produced their colostrum. So you can keep that milk separate to feed the calves for day 2 and 3 and possibly 4 on the transition milk. So it's going to complicate it a bit, but I think with some creativity, we can come up with a simple system to do that and have that benefit transferred to the calves.
And in the long run, transferred to the bottom line. That extra that change
Absolutely.
in management, it's going to take, a little more staff time
Yeah.
and maybe some extra pens or such.
And if you think about, it's going to greatly influence the infection of the calves, whether they have diarrhea or whether they have respiratory problems, their growth rate in the first 2 months, and then that directly transferred to how they grow beyond that and how much milk they produce when they're cows. That's a critical place where a small investment can have a major return.
Very good. A reminder that Dr. Kertz's column on this topic is posted below if you'd like to read through that. Thank you, Dr. Kertz, for joining us again here this month. As always, we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. Tomorrow on Feedstuffs 365, we take a look at gut health and how it can safely be controlled through new double encapsulated technology. Then on Thursday, we'll be taking a look at feed formulation and feeding practices related to zinc in swine diets. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.